So now that spring break is over, we have just a few classes after this. A week from today is the third exam. The study guide is available on Blackboard for it. It will cover everything up through Thursday's class. So don't forget that. There is still one more essay that's due, so don't forget that as well. Today we are going to be talking about two major Chinese religions. In some sense, kind of continuing on with the idea of indigenous religions. While indigenous religions primarily refer to things like traditional Native American, African, Australian religions, in a sense, both Confucianism and Daoism represent religions predominantly in China. Now, with the rise of immigration, certainly they have appeared in other places, but they still predominantly remain Chinese religions. There are a few people that might convert to Taoism, not too many that would convert to Confucianism. And one of the other things that is a challenge for these is to classify them. Should they be considered philosophies or should they be considered religions? In many respects, there's a lot of things related to these two systems, let's just say, that are philosophical in nature. A lot of it is based on teachings of specific leaders or texts. But in both of these, a variety of rituals have developed that kind of move it past just a philosophical introspection to a more religious type of character. As we begin, we'll start with Confucianism and then move to Daoism, although they both predominantly develop around the same time. That 6th century BC time, right? The time of the Upanishads, the time of Buddhism, the time of major changes in Jainism, the time of the destruction of the Jewish temple. We have both the rise of Confucius and his teachings, as well as some of the major things that developed in Taoism. But before we even get to that, I do want to say a couple things related to Chinese thought in general. In many respects, Confucianism, along with Taoism and Buddhism, are found prevalent among a lot of people in China. And among these so-called three teachings, people will mix and mingle ideas. They're not really strict Buddhists, strict Confucians, or strict Taoists, but instead often intermingle the ideas. Now in the West we might think of it as, well, you're either, for example, Christian, or you're Muslim, or you're Buddhist. It's not the same kind of way, or the same way it's thought of in China. Instead, there is a way in which certain aspects of each of those teachings serve different purposes in the life of the Chinese. And so this is reflected in a variety of popular sayings. Every Chinese person, for example, wears a Confucian cap, a Taoist robe, and Buddhist sandals, and to suggest that these are all part of one's life. I think this one kind of clarifies that a little bit of how these religions function for people. Everyone is a Confucian at work, a Taoist at leisure, and a Buddhist at death. The idea being that Confucianism helps you understand your responsibilities in life with respect to work or education. But it does not speak, in the minds of a lot of people, to some of these other things. When it comes to leisure time, the emphasis is more that Taoism provides guides for how you spend your non-working time. And of all, Buddhism is the one out of these three that relates to death. But to strictly separate them, however, is to ignore the fact that Confucian ideas do talk about leisure and death, so does Taoism, and Buddhism, of course, has ideas about work and leisure as well. But these three have become very intermingled in the Chinese population. And now, that's, of course, not addressing the sizable number of Chinese who were Christian, and there are a few other religions there as well in China. As I mentioned before, Confucius lived during that 6th century time. And as we saw in India and in Israel, there was a great deal of political instability at the time of Confucius. There's a lot of turmoil that politically was going on. It's a time when the Zhou dynasty was kind of breaking up, and there were a variety of wars that were causing people to become separate from each other. Statelets were developing in China as opposed to a unified state. And in the midst of all this confusion and instability, there were a variety of philosophical and predominantly political schools that developed to try and shape the country and provide stability. Some of those schools said that stability would occur through military force. Others said that if everyone would just express love toward each other, that would bring harmony in society, which would lead to political stability. Other Other people claimed that the way to provide stability was to kind of retreat from nature, or retreat from society into nature, and that somehow the trappings of society had removed us away from our natural selves. Confucius and his followers, however, presented something different. Instead of this retreat from society, or an attempt to get away from society, the Confucians argued that you had to be a part of society and act ethically and follow certain rituals, follow a certain etiquette. And if everyone would do that, stability would come. In other words, change began with the individual. And that primary individual in all of this is a man named Confucius. We know him by his Latinized name, Confucius. As Catholic missionaries made their way into China in the 16th and 1700s, as they came in contact with the teachings of Master Kong, is what Confucius translates to, they referred to him as Confucius. He lived in a country where the Zhou dynasty was not very powerful, but instead was broken up into a variety of feudal lords. He was a descendant, quite possibly, of a royal house, but a royal house that by his time had largely fell out of favor. And so a lot of the political position that his family had prior to his time had disappeared. Confucius never truly held a political position, although he had a lot to say about politics. The highest office that he appears to have held publicly as a politician was police commissioner in his home state. But instead of being active politically, a lot of his influence came through his teaching. However, it's not until after his death that Confucius really becomes historically significant. It wasn't like he was this great, powerful individual during his time. The major work containing the teachings of Confucius is known as the Analects. It appears that the Analects were recorded after his death by his students, even though Confucius himself was literate. So that means now that we've seen several of these very important religious leaders who don't write things down. We talked about Muhammad, we talked about the Buddha, we have Confucius. Jesus, of course, did not spend, the only thing we know about Jesus writing down is in the ground when he's presented with a woman taken in adultery. That's the only thing we have Jesus writing, though probably all of those individuals were literate. And so after his death, the teachings that had been passed orally were eventually written down. Much like the teaching of Socrates, or even what we see in the New Testament, a lot of the teachings that are recorded came from these kind of question and answer sessions where students would ask Confucius things, or Confucius would kind of turn the tables on his students and ask them to try and work through a particular situation. Very important in Confucian thought, and very important in Chinese thought in general, is the concept of beyond. Translate to something like heaven, and so in English you'll sometimes hear, or you'll sometimes see, Confucius talking about heaven. It's unclear, though, what he means. There's some indication that beyond refers to a divine being as opposed to a place, like what we think of heaven. Other times it kind of sounds more like an impersonal force. And so it's not about a place so much as this force or being that guides society. The main point, though, out of beyond, is that people, especially rulers, should follow the laws of heaven, and that heaven has bestowed certain laws that need to be followed. Confucius himself thought of himself, or talked about himself, as a transmitter of social values. He claimed that all he was doing was teaching what people in society already believed. But he was not without his innovation. If we take beyond as an impersonal force, there isn't much within Confucius' teaching about God or any sort of spiritual being. Ancestor worship, of course, has always been very, very prominent in Chinese religion, but Confucius wanted to move people away from that. He also tended to have a very reformist view of the state, right? Wanting to see the state make some reforms. Particularly when it came to this, one of the things that is emphasized within respect to social order was it was more important for a person to be noble because they were virtuous and not because of who they were born to. Right? And so the nobility for Confucius came from your character, not from your family line. Confucius is perhaps best known for his sayings. Probably, though, if you would Google Confucius says, most of the things that would come up were not things that Confucius said. Instead, there are some things, though, that in the Analects Confucius did say that reflect a lot of his thinking about society, about character, about life. Let's talk about a couple of these and see if we can pull together what he's saying. We're not going to talk about all these. But on this slide, what do you think he means by the superior man is modest in his speech but exceeds in his actions?
Perhaps someone who, like, the promising things actually.
Okay. All right. So somebody that is not all talk, we might say, right? Is out there doing what they're supposed to do. You know, I think that's probably what it is. It's not like get rid of your speech, but more like kind of let your life, be your testament. Or we could maybe put it in another way: let your life show the so shine before people, that they may see your good works. But of course, Jesus also says so that they might glorify your Father in heaven, and that's not something that Confucius necessarily said. What do you think he means by "be not ashamed of mistakes and thus make them crimes"? What's the advice he's offering here? Okay, part of it has to do with learning from mistakes. What else do you think you might be suggesting here? What can we do with mistakes?
Sometimes when we make mistakes, we make them a lot bigger than they actually are, or we'll internally, not just externally, but internally, and we'll tear ourselves down with those mistakes, and it'll keep us from succeeding in the future with large checkers account.
Yeah, so there's this kind of, we can let our mistakes define us, we can blow them out of proportion, right? And so it's a mistake, move on, right? Don't dwell on these kind of things. Let's look at a couple of other ones. How about this one in the middle? The man of virtue makes the difficulty to be overcome his first business and success only a subsequent consideration.
You control what you can control first, which is yourself, and then after that you move on.
Okay. What might be another way to think about?
If you're working hard in virtue, if that's not going to be your goal, but it's just kind of like a happy accident.
Okay. I think another way to think about it, I think those are, a lot of these you can, there's a variety of ways to interpret them. The way I think of is the focus of, where your focus is, right? Don't be focusing down the road, be focusing on what you need to take care of first. But all of these, you see, he's trying to guide people. And in their sayings, of course, they're very parabolic in nature. These very short little statements. Another aspect of Confucius' teaching that we've seen already in other places is what is called the silver rule. Something again found in the teachings of other philosophies. Do not do unto others what you would not like to have done to you. Now, what's the difference here between, I call this the silver rule, in contrast, of course, to the golden rule of Jesus. What's different about this than the golden rule?
So the do unto others, do not do unto others, like the negative version.
Yeah, and maybe by referring to it as the silver rule, people in other places were trying to elevate Jesus' teaching. But I think also what you have here is this kind of negative approach versus Jesus' more proactive approach. It's not just don't do to others what you won't like to have done to you. For Jesus is actively do. Right? And so it's not like just avoid doing things. It's about proactively. And so these kind of, there's a similar statement in the Mishnah, for example. Rabbi Hillel said something almost exactly the same. The Buddha said things very similar. But this idea of thinking about your actions, treating others as you would like to be treated, common view. Obviously, there are a lot more sayings of Confucius, but these are just a few to kind of give you some ideas about what are the important things in Confucianism. Now, again, whether we can classify Confucianism as a religion or not, it definitely has a lot to say about human relationships, which all religions, in a sense, do have a component that talks about what's it like to live among other people. But for Confucianism especially, the ultimate meanings of life are to be found in how you relate to other human beings. Right? There isn't this kind of ultimate meaning in the sense of going to heaven, God guiding everything. There's some of that, but the ultimate meanings are found in how you relate to each other. Very important in all of this are the key virtues of reciprocity and neighborliness, which we kind of see from the silver rule. Right? Do not do unto others what you would not like to have done to you. Right? So there's that reciprocity. Right? That how you treat others is how you're going to be treated. You should treat others like you would like to be treated, as well as neighborliness. Right? That you shall love your neighbor as yourself is another way to think of it. And that's reflected in a very important concept within Confucianism, and that's the 5 relationships. A key aspect of the 5 relationships is this idea of neighborliness. We are related to people around us in certain ways, and they bring with them responsibilities and guidelines for how to live. The 5 relationships for Confucianism are the relationship between ruler and official, father and son, husband, wife, elder sibling, younger sibling, and relationships between friends. Now, not only should we think of elder sibling, younger sibling, but in general, it's kind of very similar between just the older people in society and the younger people in society. As you can see from this list, 3 of those relationships are family relationships. They are guidelines for how to live in family. But the other 2, friend to friend and ruler to official, are meant to be understood in familial types of ways. Friend relationships are to be understood as being very similar to sibling relationships. Right? And so if your friend is older, then there's some respect that you're to offer that older friend, even though they're your friend. The ruler official is meant to be understood much like the father-son relationship, with the ruler kind of being a fatherly type of figure, and then the son, following after that. And in a sense, also, it wouldn't just be like the emperor and the ministers, the officials that they have, but also ruler and then subjects would also be understood in this way as well. There's a reciprocity to these things. While officials owe obedience and reverence to the ruler owes protection, safety, guidance to the officials, right? So there's responsibilities on both of these. They must care for their subjects. Children owe respect to their parents. Parents should care for their children.